We welcome everyone to this session. This course is Climate Change Communication in Agriculture. It is hosted by the Department of Agricultural Extension and Rural Development of Alex Ekwueme Federal University, Ndufu-Alike. In this particular aspect of this lecture series, we want to look at the concept of climate change. In discussing the concept of climate change, we expect that at the end of this session, each and every candidate, after going through the slide, should be able to define climate change, give a concise definition of climate change, not filled with academic jargons or professional jargons, but filled with simple terms that the person on the street, the local farmer, will be able to understand effectively. So that's what we expect, that you should define climate change. Be able to also look at the parameters for climate change assessment. How do we assess climate change? Why do we say the climate is changing? How do you arrive at that concept? And then we look at also how climate change affects farmers. Are there ways, are there things that happen around the farmer themselves that seem to point that the climate is changing? At the end of that, we will now give you a pointer to the next class that we'll be having after this. So let's look at the idea of climate change. Let's define climate change. First of all, it's good that we establish that climate change has been there for years now, but what we are having currently is an increase in advocacy regarding mitigating climate change, adapting to climate change, establishing climate change resilience, and building our buffer capacity and adaptive capacity. Change is alterations in the mean atmospheric condition of an area over a period of time. Normally, we don't say climate is changing until we've looked at events happening around rainfall, rainfall regimes, rainfall duration. Look at events around temperature, mean temperature, maximum temperature, minimum temperature. We look at things relating to relative humidity. We look at the things surrounding number of hours of sunshine. These elements, desertification, the rate of desertification. We look at the rates of flooding. These elements are part of the things that we consider as climate change. As these things either increase or decrease from what should be average, then the climate is changing. What are the sources of climate change? The sources of climate change, first of all, are both natural and human. There are natural occurrences that are beyond human control that may account for climate change. But the core challenge we have that has given birth to climate change that I want this class to keep an eye on are pressing human activities, industrialization, destruction of the ozone layer. You must have heard this from secondary school days. Due to the release of greenhouse gases, these things have really brought serious challenge man and his activities. Even agriculture. In rice production, there is the complaint of the release of methane that comes from rice paddy. It's also a factor that is influencing climate change. Look at the way we clear forest for agricultural purposes. It's also a factor in climate change. We look at the pollution that go on every day. They are all sources of climate change. So I'm sure you'll be able to discuss sources of climate change subsequently, and then look at the next issue we want to consider here, the assessment. How do we assess climate change? Do we just wake up one morning and say, wow, the climate is changing? Or do we just listen to people and then we say, yeah, the climate is changing? No, climate change should be assessed. And yes, climate change is being assessed. How should climate change be assessed? First of all, we want to agree with scholars that there should be an erudite, quantitative, and qualitative evaluation of what we have on ground before we can claim that climate is really changing. If we do not have data, if we do not have results, if we do not have those measurable outputs, we will be gaze walking to say that the climate is changing. So the ideal way of assessing this climate is usually by data. We collect data from meteorological centers. When you collect data from meteorological centers, usually over 30 years minimum, a period of 30 years, you look at what has happened to rainfall in Igbo in the past 30 years. What has happened to temperature? Is it decreasing or increasing in Igbo in the past 30 years? What has happened to relative humidity? When we look at these variables and their trend over a period of time, we can now say the climate is changing. We may also look at this data and say, no, climate is not changing, everything is normal. Especially when we compare the mean average variables, average results from this data. You can get data for climate change assessment easily from meteorological centers. Here in Nigeria, we have the Nigerian Meteorological Center, the NIMET. You go to the NIMET, you can get data. Then other national data sources that, of course, also originate their data from NIMET and from other agencies. Now, for the farmers, it's often a practice among us to go to the field and ask a local farmer, is the climate changing? And then the farmer says, yes. We cannot per se agree to the fact that the climate is changing because a local farmer who does not have the statistics say the climate is changing. So what we do in agri extension is that we do a perception study. We want to see how farmers perceive the climate change. Do they perceive it as real? Do they perceive it as mere Western rhetorics? So in extension, perception study is how farmers assess the climate change. The argument has been there whether data is supreme to perception or perception is supreme to data. But then we know that we wouldn't have been going for perception studies if data did not tell us that things are not the same. We also know that we wouldn't have agreed with the data if human beings are not telling us that things have changed. So the two will be very important. So we move now further to look at what now becomes the ideal for extension. Do we rely on data alone? Do we rely on the perception of farmers? The ideal thing for extension is to rely on both the data and the perception of farmers. That's the ideal thing for extension. Extension should rely on both data and the perception of the farmers. So we want to know what the data is saying and what the farmer is perceiving. There may be no need to ask if climate change is affecting the farmers. No, we can't go that way. What we need to find out is how is climate change affecting farmers? Because if we are discussing the effect of climate change on agricultural production, then we're talking about the farmer. We've seen, first of all, that climate change has brought about a whole lot of challenges in food production. And at the center of food production is the farmer. We've seen climate change bring about changes in rainfall, making it difficult for farmers to predict when to plant and when to harvest. We've seen climate change bringing about increase in agricultural losses. Before it's time for harvesting, you see farmers' produce either get rotten, get spoiled on the farm. We've seen climate change reducing the trust farmers have on extension. Currently, extension tells you to do this, and ideally that is what they observed from on-farm trials. But by the time they report to the farmers and the farmers implement these things, the effect of climate change will bring about an alteration in what the farmer gets and what extension must have taught the farmer. So that becomes a challenge for the farmer to trust extension. We'll discuss this in details at Communicating with Rural People. Still in line with how climate change is affecting farmers, climate change is also affecting post-harvest losses, increasing post-harvest losses. It's becoming difficult now, making it difficult to preserve agricultural produce by farmers. And when these things happen, we move to what climate change is doing to farmers' welfare. Recall that welfare is majorly an indication of revenue first, then health also. So because of climate change, we've seen a reduction in farmers' revenue. And as farmers' revenue go down, it becomes difficult for the farmers to handle other aspects of his welfare, like education, like health, leisure, and then other things that make up his well-being. For a sustainable life, the farmer will need an increased income. But if climate change now reduces crop yield and invariably farm revenue, then we expect, except where farmer must have diversified and have other means of earning, we expect that climate change will be having a negative influence on the farmer. Then we look at the climate change and food security. First of all, what is food security? Food security says, I'm not giving you a concept definition, but just to explain, availability of food at the right quality, right quantity, in the right place for people at the right moment. So that's what food security is all about. Do you have the right food? Do you have the right in terms of rightness in quality, in quantity? Is it easily accessible? For food security, a farmer or a family household is said to be food secured if they are aware of the sources of the food, if the food is also available, if they can access the food, and if they can utilize it as at when needed. Because of what climate change has done to agricultural production, you can, of course, envisage that there's a challenge with food security. You cannot guarantee adequate food production for farmers and their households. In order to meet up with this, farmers now may need to dip hands into their household savings and other income just to meet up with food demands. Here, we're not talking about sustainable food production, we're just talking about food security. And then, if climate change is dealing with food security, you can be sure that sustainable food security is also a threat. So, that is what we need to look at as we discuss climate change. As we look at climate change and how it affects farmers, these issues cannot be ignored. In our next class, we're looking at communicating climate change. We're looking at such issues that relates to defining communication. We look at what are the elements of climate change communication and what are the challenges with communicating with rural people. Let me again thank you for your time, and then hope that you go through this session and acquire all the knowledge that you need.